heirlooms, precious items, and objects in the Templar commandery closest to them. So they would go there, deposit their goods, and in exchange for that, they would receive a note written in cipher.
Every time you had to pay for something en route, you went to the local Templar commandery, who would pay the money for you, recode your chit, and you carried on. And when you came home, you brought your final chit back, and you either got a bill or the change. It was the charge card, American Express writ large.
If they were robbed or if it was found by an outsider, someone, it would be of very little value.
But the only way you could get the money out would be to crack the code. And the Templars, obviously, given their reputation for secrecy, were very good at keeping their own codes out of enemy hands.
The services offered by the Templars became the model for today's banking system. Money transfers, credit and checking, safety deposit boxes, pension plans, and wills. But their most controversial service was providing loans.
They became bankers in a very, very big way. They lent to emperors, priests, bishops, kings. There was a church law against charging interest, so they didn't charge interest, they charged rent. It was a neat little euphemism to get round it.
Despite its strict laws against usury, the church looked the other way. This was the first of many concessions made to the Templars. In 1139, Pope Innocent II, a former protege of Bernard, the Templars' patron, issued a papal bull which bestowed unprecedented privileges on the Knights Templar.
The Templars got an extraordinary package of perks from the Catholic Church. They were allowed to cross borders, which was a big deal back then. They were absolved from taxes. They were under no one's authority except the Pope himself, which was really an exceptional arrangement for the time.
What had prompted the Church to grant this remarkable carte blanche?
The most reasonable explanation for all of these perks was simply as a thank you, if you will, for protecting the pilgrims. But I'm skeptical as to whether that was really the true purpose.
Some suspect the autonomy granted to the Templars was not a reward, but a kind of hush money.
There were many possibilities for why this sweetheart deal was struck. It could have been that the church didn't want information to get out. The first theory about why this would have happened was that the Templars found extraordinary items and relics and scrolls underneath the Temple of Solomon. Scrolls that were not quite along lines of Catholic orthodoxy. For instance, the possibility of a more significant relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, a different account of what happened with Jesus and the apostles, or anything that was a variation of what was in the approved canons of the Bible.
Whatever the reasons behind the new privileges, the Templars used them to amass greater power and influence in all aspects of medieval life. They began building churches and castles and to buy farms and vineyards. They dabbled in manufacturing and the import and export of trade goods. An elaborate hierarchy was set up. Each country had its own Templar master overseeing the regional headquarters, or commandery, but ruling over all was the Templar Grand Master. Elected for life, the Grand Master controlled both the military wing in the east and oversaw the Order's holdings in the west.
All of their estates in Europe essentially were businesses that helped support the eastern end of things. So you see the Templars in Europe running farms, vineyards, tile factories, anything that can make money, they were in there.
It has been suggested that probably about 5% were even in places where battles were being fought. So a very small percentage were knights fighting Muslims. The vast majority of Knights Templars were part of the infrastructure that kept those knights fighting.
But even as the Templars' Western Empire flourished, their efforts in the Middle East were beginning to unravel, as rivalries sprang up between the various Christian factions.
The Christians were disunified at each other's throats. You know, they've been arguing for decades, basically, and it fundamentally weakened their position.
The turning point came in 1187, in the desert beyond the Sea of Galilee. After a century of conflict, the stage was set for one of the most grueling battles of the Crusades. The Templar warriors put their lives on the line and their fate in the hands of their commander, Gerard de Riedefort.
Gerard de Riedefort, who was the Grand Master of the Templars at the time, was a very hot-tempered and impetuous man, not awfully bright when it came to strategy.
Bound by their oaths of loyalty and blind obedience, the Templars rode into battle. A battle that was to spell the end not only of the Crusades, but of the Templars themselves. The 4th of July, 1197. A battle was about to begin. Named after the Horns of Hattin, the two rocky peaks that rise over the brush-covered slopes behind Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee. This battle became known as the turning point of the Crusades, and in the fate of a mysterious military order known as the Knights Templar. On that day, some 80 Templar knights, led by their Grand Master Gerard, joined with the main Crusader army, a consortium of several Christian factions. Estimated at around 20,000 in number, they converged at a camp near Sephoria. Once again, they were to confront Saladin, the great Muslim leader, who had laid siege to the town of Tiberias, a day's march away. His army was only slightly larger, but he had more knights. The Christian forces had mostly foot soldiers. The Crusader leaders were aware of their disadvantage.
The Crusaders had a decision to make, whether or not to move their forces out to meet Saladin's approaching army, or to stay put and let the army come to them.
And the general consensus at the council was that it was high summer, the land was parched, and the safest and most sensible thing to do was stay in very easily defensible positions and let Saladin come to them.
But not everyone agreed, including Gerard de Riedefort, who had risen to the rank of Templar Grand Master just 3 years earlier.
The Grand Master of the Templars would often do things contrary to what everybody else thought, just to get his own way and to stay in control.
Gerard had long-standing grudges against some of his Crusader allies, personal prejudices that are said to have colored his actions on this crucial day.
Because this idea of staying put had been put forward by his rival, he browbeat and bullied the entire assembly into deciding to march, not at night in the cool, but in daytime. And against a general of Salah ad-Din's reputation and skill, that was fatal.
The Crusader army began its grueling desert march towards Tiberias without water or shelter. Weak and disorientated, that evening was when Saladin's forces closed in to surround them.
Saladin's forces set the brush in the desert on fire at night, causing lots of smoke and discomfort to the Crusaders and making their already parched existence even more unbearable.
In the attack that followed, the Christian forces were soon decimated. It was the worst single military disaster in the Holy Land. The surviving Christian knights were sold into slavery. As was customary, the Templar knights were all put to the sword. But the Templar Grand Master, Gerard de Riedefort, broke the Templar vow never to be taken alive. He allowed himself to be spared and ransomed. A few months later, in the Battle of Acre, he was again captured and this time beheaded. For the Crusaders,